Today, we're going to continue our discussion on Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. It was published in 2017, and probably one of the best books that I've read. Maybe you guys differ or disagree, but one of the best books that you can read in order to really widen your perspective on what inequality is and what it's looked like for ever since we have records available. And it's interesting because in the book he discusses the fact that he couldn't even have written it 10, 15 years ago, because the research has progressed to such a point that we are almost just as close to a lot of these cultures and as the people that were actually living them. We've got enough data that we can go back and we can reconstruct to at least a general degree, and to the satisfaction of anybody who is interested in actually learning, using whatever is available. We can reconstruct the hierarchies, how people were treated, and how elites gained their power, and what they did with their power. And so, when you look around it today, inequality is still, it's just a fundamental characteristic, a fundamental fact of human existence that pretty much kind of determines, our lives to a large degree, which is why it's such a hot button issue, and has been a hot button issue that has triggered revolutions. And today, it continues to trigger people's sense of injustice and unfairness, due to the fact that some people are born in positions where they can, they're born into success, and they just, for whatever reason, they can't even fail out of it. They just keep failing upwards and upwards and upwards. And, other people are born into, a poverty, and they work as hard as they can, and they will never, ever be able to reach such levels. And it could be one person. You could do an experiment if you had that kind of power, and just take one person, clone them, and put one into a great riches, a family of riches, and the other into a family of poverty, and watch what happens. It's obvious, it's patently obvious that inequality exists, and that there is something very highly problematic about it. But the underlying problem is that we don't know what to do about it. And if you're serious about the problem, then getting to the really underlying factors and understanding how long it's been around, what has been done before, what can be done, all of these things are important for any student, any serious student of history.
Mm-hmm. Well, when we covered the first chapter in a previous show, I think one of the main points from there was the different types of inequality throughout history, because the type of inequality that we are familiar with is a relatively recent phenomenon, pretty much from the advent of agriculture. And before then, in the Paleolithic era, the more tribal cultures, there was inequality, but it took a different form. It wasn't really the vast economic inequalities that we see. It was more status-based. There were economic inequalities in certain situations, like we gave the example of tribes that lived on basically next to a rare resource. So it might be a prime river fishing location or something. So they'd basically get essentially a monopoly on that resource, and that resulted in a more stratified hierarchical form of inequality within those tribes. But on the whole, things were pretty much more equal than any society after the advent of agriculture. And then once we get agriculture, that produces the possibility for great inequality, because now you have the possibility for surplus production. So once you have surplus production, it's a matter of who's going to control that and how are they going to control it. And for our entire history since then, it has been those, basically it's been the people people can control that and have it for themselves if they have the power of violence, essentially, to control it and to prevent any possible people from taking that. So, well, what you needed to do is you needed to protect that surplus with essentially a private military or a police force or whatever. So there's, for the history of inequality and for the history of modern economics in the sense of like the last 10 years, there's been this relationship, this almost intertwined relationship between wealth and possessing power. And that is like the element of coercion and the threat of violence and the use of violence. So there's been this link between violence and wealth. And so that, like I said, allowed for a new form of inequality, an inequality of a degree that wasn't even possible beforehand. Because now you have surplus production. You've got the potential to create and to hold on to a lot more than will just basically let you live a subsistence lifestyle. But even then, after that, there are still variations in the types of inequality that we've seen since then. So this second chapter that we're looking at looks at the Roman and the various Chinese empires around the same time periods. So, around 2,000 years ago, and then, before or after. And Scheidel points out mostly the similarities between those two systems, but also the differences. One of the things that stood out to me before getting into a lot of the details is that this was a form of inequality that doesn't have, it has some things in common, again, with, let's say, modern Western societies and even Eastern societies like China. But there's a difference back then, because these were still pre-industrial societies. And so one of the points, I want to get into just a little bit of the background to understand the types of inequality that Scheidel's talking about. He gets into like Gini coefficients and things like that. So for those unfamiliar with that, Gini is Gini. It's basically a measure of a society's resources and then how those are distributed. So if everyone has exactly the same amount, that would be a Gini distribution of like 0. But if one person has all the wealth essentially and everyone else is just at subsistence, that would be like a 1. Or I think that's the way it is. I don't know if I can't remember if one person has everything and everyone else will basically die.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Okay, yeah. So basically you can't, in practice, you'll never get a Gini coefficient of 1 because most societies will, the majority of people will be at a subsistence level because they're essential for you need those people at the bottom in order to hold up the people at the top. If everyone else dies and you're the only person with all the wealth, you're going to die too, essentially. So there's always some wealth at the bottom, even if it's just at a subsistence level. But there's another limiting factor on the Gini coefficient, and this is he gets into it in the appendix. And what it basically means is that if you take a society, it depends on how much, or like a nation or whatever, it depends on how much money and production that economy produces. Because if you have, let's say, let's just take a hypothetical example of like this fictional country with 100 people. So the GDP might be $100. And so a perfectly distributed equal system, each person gets or has $1, right? So everyone has 1. Now, if the GDP is 101, then you can have 99 people with $1 and then one person with $2. So that person has twice as much wealth as everyone else, but it's not a very big difference. The Gini coefficient is going to be really low because there's just not enough surplus to make a big difference between the lowest and the top. So when you have, let's say, like a GDP of 1 million for these 100 people, and each person, 99 people are still only have $1, and then one other person has essentially, just shy of $1 million, that's a huge disparity and a very high inequality measure, Gini coefficient. So basically what that shows is that the Gini coefficient is limited by the total wealth or production within any individual country. So the point he makes about these empires, the Roman and the Chinese, was that because they were pre-industrial, like their GDP, equivalent GDP, trying to figure it out in terms of which we think about modern GDPs, wasn't very high. I think at one point he says that in the Roman Empire, it was something like just maybe 2 times like the subsistence level. And modern economies go several orders of magnitude higher than that, above subsistence. So there wasn't a lot of money relatively to go around. But the point he makes about that is that in the Roman Republic, I'll just read a quote where he's talking about just the estimate that he and others have come up with for the Gini of the Roman Republic, and maybe up to the time of the Empire too. But he basically says that during these periods there were like 100 and what was it? He's giving the number of households, and basically that about 1.5% of all households captured between a sixth and close to a third of the total output. And this equated to about a Gini in the low 0.4s. And a lot of modern societies, like Western societies, are in the mid 0.4s or even up to like low 0.5s. So it's looks a little bit low and comparable to modern inequality. But he points out that this value is actually much higher than it might seem. Because average per capita GDP amounted to only about twice minimum subsistence net of tax and investment, the projected level of Roman income inequality was not far below the maximum that was actually feasible at that level of economic development, a feature shared by many other pre-modern societies. Measured against the share of GDP that was available for extraction from primary producers, Roman inequality was therefore extremely severe. At most, a tenth of the population beyond the wealth elite would have been able to enjoy incomes well above bare subsistence levels. So essentially, what you had in the Roman Republic and even more so, I guess, in the Empire, in the hundreds of years after the fall of the Republic, was an extremely unequal system where the elite class had essentially everything. Like the top 12% had all the wealth. Everyone else was living bare subsistence. So this would be like pretty much below poverty levels in a lot of developed countries. And so their Gini, like that was the maximum Gini they could possibly have in order to survive. If they were making modern GDPs, their Gini might have gone up to 0.6, 0.7, 0.8 because you can bigger, richer societies have a higher capacity for inequality. So that's something to just keep in mind in general for when reading articles about inequality and Gini coefficients, is that there are factors that you have to take into account to provide the context for what that number actually means. Because you can have what seems to be a low Gini compared to other countries, but that might mean that in essence, in practice, that society might be vastly more unequal than a country with a higher Gini coefficient. It really depends on how you look at it. So a developing country with a Gini of 0.4, that might mean that pretty much everyone is in total poverty and a tiny percent of the population has everything. Whereas in a richer country, you can have the majority of the population at several times, or maybe not several times, but significantly above the poverty level and above subsistence levels, and then like an even larger group that has even more of an even more absolute number of the wealth or amount of the wealth. So there are all these different factors that you have to look at when thinking about inequality. Whether it's absolute or relative, and what the GDP is of these countries, like per capita. All of these things you have to be taken into account to understand it. So when you're looking at the Roman and the Chinese empires of these times, you really get the picture that well, things were bad. It's like you think inequality is bad now in an absolute monarchical dictatorship. things were a lot more extreme. And in this chapter, he gives an explanation of how this happened, how this progressed. And again, part of it has to do with you have these surpluses of production. You have essentially extra food. You have grain. Who controls that? And then, who's going to control that? It's the person with the most power. Eventually, you get to this system, like in China, where the warring kingdoms were united. And now you have this essentially this absolute government that has control over everything, and that those resources are then controlled by the might of the military. And I don't know, do we want to get into details about how that happened?
I just wanted to jump in there because what's interesting about this chapter, that, like you said, focuses on the inequality within empires, is that most often, if there was any attempt to create greater equalization and less income inequality, it most often took the form of elitist infighting. In other words, occasionally you had a revolt among the peasant class here and there, especially in the Chinese Empire, and in the Roman Empire, you did have a kind of working class struggle, if you want to call it that, sort of supporting those senators and those individuals who would, like the Gracchi brothers, who would push forward with agrarian bills. But most often, the biggest leveling we saw of any kind wasn't really a leveling at all. It was more, one group of semi-militarized political class families, aristocrats, who were fighting and usurping the other factions, and they would take turns over a period of hundreds of years, toppling one another. Mm-hmm. So, taking a step back from it, the impression I got was that the working class or the slaves or the peasantry were quite often so disenfranchised, so afar from wielding any kind of economic or political power that they didn't even have the opportunity or the means or a hint of it to put forward any kind of viable way of maintaining a more equal distribution of wealth. So this was an interesting part of it to me, because what we learn from Scheidel's book, at least in this part of it, is that there was no opportunity for many individuals to create any kind of lasting and viable distribution of wealth. As I just said, it was just a kind of a permanent underclass of disenfranchised individuals who were existing as farmers or merchants or craftsmen, really much at the whims of whoever was then in power. And also, to put a point on it, we, like you said, Harrison, these are empires we're talking about. So a lot of the power that was held by the governments at the time was at the force of a military or a police state, so to say, who had administrative control over the courts and who were able to tax and individuals and confiscate their land or redistribute it as they saw fit. And it could have only been accomplished with the power of brute strength and force. So, as we kind of look at contemporary times a little bit, there are some differences, but certainly some parallels, I think, on a global scale of, what an empire looks like and how it behaves, and what it does. And when you compare these empires to what some might consider the Western Empire, and you look at the same dynamics involved, there's not much has changed in thousands of years. The same dynamics seem to be at play. There's this, the vassal states and countries that have been kind of forcibly manipulated and coerced to do the bidding of these militarized, big bully, countries.
I'd say maybe one thing I just want to riff on that point really quick was the idea that like nothing really has changed in that way, but it's like people's perspective on it has changed, and I mean economically, technologically, a lot has changed, sure, but people expect the state or the government, to do something good for the people. There's something good about government. Government can come in and legalize things and prohibit this, prohibit that. It can, protect you or, protect you from the evildoers or whatever. There's something about government that is, that can be good. And that's a concept that's pretty relatively new. I mean, it probably dates back to like the revolutions, the revolutionaries, John Locke and Thomas Hume and all those philosophers, and kind of a more modern way of viewing the individual and the social contract, and that we are all in this together, and that there are some values that are higher than us or the government, and that there is something objectively and absolutely true about justice, and it doesn't depend on the whims of those in power. So there's some sort of shared sentiment there, but deep down, I mean, like you're saying, I think that everything is pretty much functions, especially behind the scenes, and then it's just kind of sugar-coated for mass consumption in the same way. I just want to read what Walter Scheidel had to write about that. He writes that from a contemporary perspective, states are considered to be failing if they are unable to supply public goods to their members. Corruption, lack of security, breakdown of public services and infrastructure, and loss of legitimacy serve as markers of state failure. Yet this definition holds states to standards that need not have applied in the more distant past. The notion that states are supposed to provide varied public goods beyond basic security, and that failure or collapse can be inferred from their inability to meet this expectation, seems anachronistic for most of history. For the purposes of this global survey, we are better served by a bare-bones characterization of essential state functions. Inasmuch as pre-modern polities focused in the first instance on checking internal and external challengers, protecting the key allies and associates of rulers, and extracting the revenues required to perform these tasks and enrich the power elite, state failure is best understood as the loss of the capacity to accomplish these basic objectives. So it all revolves around a small power elite, a small group that has shared goals, shared interests, which is to enrich themselves, to gain power, to thwart external enemies. And if you do what you have to do to keep the plebes happy or whatever, to keep, if you're not strong enough that you can't just brutally thwart them and enslave them like they did in Barbados when they would just work people to death and slave and chain gangs, then you've got bread and circuses or whatever to keep people at least pacified, and the entire way you're raking in billions and billions and billions, and you're buying up land, and you're just doing whatever you can to make sure that you and your own are set up as far into the future as possible. But the problem is that then you're in that position and you have a big target on your back, so it's constantly live by the sword and die by the sword, as he shows throughout the book. But the interesting thing is that no matter how many times an elite family loses all that they have to another elite family, that general state continues to grow, and it continues to become more powerful and continues to increase the inequality levels and the Gini coefficient there to the breaking point. So it doesn't really matter who's meet the old boss same as the new boss same as the old boss. The same thing continues to happen. And on a deep level, I think that one reason why people are so anxious about levels of high inequality is that when it gets really bad, it's kind of like a harbinger of doom. The great, what is the name of the book? The Great Leveler, Violence. He talks about the four horsemen, mass mobilization warfare, revolution, state failure, and lethal pandemics. And state failure can come about because of massive climate disruptions and all that kind of stuff. It's usually when there's a lot of inequality, then for whatever reason, it's like something clicks and then boom, everything starts crashing down to the ground for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, you gave, one example of one of the things you were talking about, the elite infighting, is he gives an example from China where the system had basically evolved to the point where you had what were essentially local leaders that had a vast amount of power over their constituency, essentially. And they were at one point essentially warlords because they had enough power that they could do what they wanted with what was going on in their region. And if one of those families or rulers got weak, then it wasn't just other elite families that were smelling that and coming in for a fresh kill because they smelled the weakness of this one leader. The subjects of that person would even turn against the leader. So once the leader showed signs of weakness and losing power, they might ally with another strong man from another region to take him out and get a new warlord put in place. Mm-hmm. So the system was self-reinforcing on multiple levels. It's like no one was trying to change it, essentially. One of the points he does make is that there were several emperors periodically throughout, especially he talks about the ones in the Chinese empires, that would try to introduce policies to level things out a bit through wealth or usually land redistribution. So or limits on the amount of land people could own, because the dynamic was that once someone got rich enough to own a chunk of land, then they had the wealth to invest in other pieces of land, and they basically acquired these mini fiefdoms, these mini kingdoms for themselves, where they owned all the land and then essentially all the people on that land. So the people underneath them essentially became serfs, slaves to a degree, where they were basically owned by that person and had all of their production expropriated for the purpose of enriching that family or that that governor. And so you get this. So you had this system of these kind of chieftains of these various regions that had control over vast amounts of land and vast amounts of people, and that's all tax revenue that can come from those sources. We'll get into that a bit, but where was I going to go with that? So you have these different families, these different rich people with a whole bunch of land. That's what the certain emperors were trying to fix, because you have basically one family with all of this land and making all of this money and getting all of this power. They tried to cut into that a bit by limiting the amount of land that people could have, but they immediately ran up against problems. It never lasted. Essentially, it was an impossible policy because, first of all, you're trying to put into practice a policy that is that goes against the interests of the class with the most money and power. So, and
the only ability to actually follow through with these policies.
Right. So it is essentially like, in a sense, it's the same problem that you get with revolutions of various sorts, where you have the weakest people trying to overthrow the strongest people with the most weapons and the most power. It's a very difficult proposition to put forward and to make it a success. So these elites had various means of getting around this. First of which was just basic corruption. They would just forge certain documents, put land titles in other people's names, change the status, like the legal status of one piece of land in order to change the tax rate, continue collecting the old tax rate, and
fix the census.
Any number of things that they could do. Plus, they had lobbies, because they were essentially a special interest group that had influence in court, in the basically all of the whisperers in the imperial court who could get their who could not only make their wishes known but then put them into practice. So because this corruption was essentially systemic throughout the whole system, what you essentially had if you had a good emperor was one emperor against everyone, like the entire elite class, who would be against any kind of policy to essentially have their stuff taken away from them. Mm-hmm. So that's one level of the complexity. The other that you guys mentioned was just the amount of infighting that went on. Because it was a constant. It's not like the rich, the elite class of these times had it easy. Sure, they had a lot. They had vast amounts of wealth and could live extravagant lives to some degree, but always with the threat of someone stabbing them in the back, which happened repeatedly. There was no security, no assured long-term security to one's status in life and the longevity of their wealth and their property. Not guaranteed. But adding another level of complexity on that, like that you were saying, Corey, despite all of this infighting, which was essentially coerced redistribution of wealth, well, this person is out of favor now. We're going to take his money and either give it to someone else or give it to the state, give it to the emperor, and redistribute it like that. I think that's all I wanted to say about that one.
So I just wanted to, while you were saying all that, I was thinking I wanted to transpose a little bit of what we had read in this chapter to current events, because it's like it's very difficult to read this without also having certain developments in politics and in the way that the U.S. functions in particular. And without seeing these parallels that are incredible to me, because, like I said earlier, I mean, it's as though there is a psychological dynamic among the elite class for this insatiable thirst for not only having a certain amount of wealth and power, but accruing more, which in their minds, I suppose, equaled maintaining their power, or at least it's kind of difficult to describe in some sense. But the point is, I think that once they've gotten onto this track of tasting a certain amount of control and accruing a certain amount of wealth, and conspiring with others in their class to make alliances and find ways of maintaining their wealth, it's like a kind of a destined, a self-imposed destined road to greed, and it's like it exists for no other reason than for their own self-gratification. So what I was thinking of was, and I mentioned this on a previous show quite briefly, this whole Hunter Biden controversy with, Joseph Biden's son becoming this kind of, sitting on the board of one of these companies in the Ukraine, where he had no experience in energy or in the particular field that they were that he was put kind of on the board of, and just a quick recap. 2014, basically, through the color revolution that was implemented in large part by the United States in an administration that Joseph Biden served as vice president of, the Ukraine becomes effectively this kind of not a protectorate, this newly formed vassal state of the American Empire, and so Biden, in perpetuating his own power in his own mind through one of his sons, puts him, or kind of shunts him into this position of power in a place it's so obvious he shouldn't be. And this is kind of largely a dynamic that's described in the chapters, because there was, the Han Dynasty. You had these warlords or householders or elitists who would, have 7 sons or 10 sons and put them in various positions of power. And this was all an effort to perpetuate the accrual of more power and more wealth. So in that sense, it's really instructive to see how the same dynamics are at play today in what might be described as capitalism's last stage in a given country, where the pathology of wealth reaches a tipping point of obviousness and exploitation, and begins to become so apparent to so many that it falls apart of its own accord. It becomes this kind of vacuous hole that sucks up everything and begs for a response from either other elites who see an opportunity, or from groups that are tired of being exploited and are become capable of responding in some way.
Well, I think that I might have an even more cynical take on that. I think that, like Corey, you read that quote in the book, and about the kind of modern views on what the state is and should be, and what governments are and should be. I think this is just kind of taking down the mask and showing what the reality is, always has been, and is everywhere. That there isn't anything special in this regard, at least, about Western democracies, is that at root, underneath the surface, they all operate on the same principles. You have the corruption just takes different and more sly forms, because the corruption in other countries, I'd say, is even more obvious and over the top, especially in developing countries where the extraction rate is even higher, reaching that top level of inequality in a given country, like in a lot of countries in Africa, for instance, where it's just a lot of the countries in Africa basically have inequality rates and types of inequality that are similar, like to the Roman Empire. And when you have these glimpses behind the veil, like behind the curtain, you see that the dynamics are the same everywhere. It's that political power is essentially a fast track to wealth and to expanding your wealth. That's the point he makes about the Roman and Chinese empires, is that office holding was a means of getting rich and holding power. That the two were inextricably intertwined. There was they were essentially systems of patronage, which is like cronyism and keeping things in the in-group, that, like, in modern Western societies, that would be like no-bid contracts, giving contracts to your buddies, overcharging for certain things so you can skim off the extra money, and various lobbying efforts and favors, under-the-table favors here and there that might look fine on paper, but they result in an economic advantage to the politician giving them. And then once you're out of political office, you just happen to be a multi-billionaire or millionaire, and no one really knows how it happens. It's just
Right.
that's just the way it works. And that's what's been going on for all of these thousands of years, where you have these and it may be that that in the States there's or in modern, not just in the States, but in modern countries in general, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the country, the class lines are more permeable. So you will get politicians that kind of go from, that build themselves from nothing to something great. So I mean, there's tons of stories about that of politicians and people in positions of power who didn't start in a kind of like an aristocratic family. You get others that did, like JFK, or George Bush. But you get plenty of people that make their way into the ruling elite class, and it was the same as the Roman Empire developed, where at first the ranks essentially were closed, and you had a very small number of like senators and people of patrician rank. But then as the years went on, that class grew and grew, and essentially it would be the equivalent of there were more and more millionaires and billionaires in the Roman Empire as things developed, and the wealth of the empire got greater and greater, and as all those things, inequality got greater and greater, but the class lines weren't so rigidly defined, and then in China. Again, you had this system that developed where even despite all of the infighting, this is a point you already made, Corey, that despite the uncertainty and the risk and the changes of fortunes between these competing families, the system itself was stable. So you always had the controlling, ruling families, and as a collective, they got progressively richer throughout time, even though the particulars and who was on top at any given moment would change at any given time. They might even all be wiped out at some point to be replaced by a totally new group, but the system itself perpetuated. And that's kind of a depressing thought when you think about it.
It's really like the snake devouring its own tail. There's no better depiction, I think, than of that.
Mm-hmm. But so that gets to the central thesis of the book, is that the only way to really change things is that historically the only thing to have changed things to any degree have been these mass catastrophes of just mass violence, basically bringing everyone down to zero to restart. But one thing to get into, I think, is that when reading these stories about how these things are set up, it seems to me that there's always a kind of mixture between what I think many people would consider legitimate ways of making money and getting rich, as opposed to like illegitimate ways. And in all of the examples of the establishment of powerful ruling elites, it's always a combination of the two. But oftentimes the illegitimate ways vastly outstrip the legitimate ways. So in the Chinese empires, basically, you could have these rich merchant classes that could essentially buy themselves into office. And an interesting thing, I don't know what to think about it yet, is that in both China and Rome, merchants were seen as like lowly people. Like the upper classes saw merchants as basically this low class, kind of beneath their contempt. Merchants weren't seen because they did business and services with the public,
Mm-hmm.
With the plebes, with the kind of the refuse of society, and so they were seen as kind of not really aristocratic material. But you get you get to the point where there are some people that become rich enough to buy themselves into the ruling class. Once they've got that, they now have the means, instead of hard work, and even if they were if they got their wealth originally through shady means and screwing people over, now they had even more opportunities to use even more, let's say, criminal means of getting more wealth. Right. So now once you're in the ruling class, you have the ability to basically fleece the locals, using all the means and techniques we mentioned just a few minutes ago, whether it's changing the census records, fudging with the tax records and the classifications of land, and all of these ways of covering up the kind of theft of money for oneself, which was an agreed upon practice. Like everyone knew everyone else was doing it, even if you fell out of favor, it could be used against you to have your stuff expropriated. You had, not only did you have all this, you had you yourself now as part of the ruling elite weren't taxed. Like, you were exempt from taxation, and the at a certain level of status, the emperor was the courts essentially needed the emperor's permission to charge you with anything. So now you entered into a new justice bracket where the laws didn't apply to you. So there's this lawless environment that you enter into where you are empowered and incentivized to not only fleece the public, but get away with whatever crime you want, essentially. Again, always keeping in mind that if you mess with the wrong people or anger the wrong people, you could bear the brunt of that and lose everything. But you had vastly more opportunities for getting wealth in an underhanded and kind of criminal way. And one of the points he makes is that the higher your status, the more you are able to fleece, essentially. And he gives examples of just the amount of money that each level could make, where if you were a close minister of the emperor, you made just billions and billions and billions. Some level just below that would be, maybe an order of magnitude lower, and then it was like the higher you are, the more graft you got, essentially.
I've got a few examples that I pulled from the book. Scheidel writes, provincial governors were paid up to 1 million sesterces a year for their good services, but continued to extract great wealth on the side. One governor entered the province of Syria as a pauper and left it rich, filthy rich, 2 years later. A centurion, a governor of southern Spain, unwisely bragged in his correspondence that he had extorted 4 million sesterces from his provincials and had even sold some of them into slavery, just to make a little bit of extra money. Much farther down the food chain, an imperial slave overseeing the imperial treasury in Gaul commanded the services of 16 under-slaves, 2 of whom were in charge of his apparently extensive set of silverware.
Yeah.
So a slave himself had 2 under-slaves. There was an even filthier underclass devoted to, the petty tyranny of the slaves. It sounds like that was the structure of society, was just tyranny, and you just fleece whoever you can for whatever you can get, and that's the moral code, is that the might with might comes right,
and that's the way the system of Roman government was set up, where if you got your consulship to basically rule one of the provinces, it was accepted that you were going to fleece the locals, because now you could tax them. You basically determined how much they had, and then took as much as you could. When the interest rate was like 6% in Rome, in some of the provinces it was like 48%, and they'd basically go and just figure out how much they could take, and that was an agreed upon practice. But again, even in Rome, if you got caught and someone didn't like you, they could bring you to court, and potentially you could suffer for it. So that happened all the time too. It was a constant battle of how much can I take, and how can I get away with it by not pissing off the wrong people. And so a constant jockeying for power, but it didn't stop anyone from doing these things. It was because that was common practice. It was, how much can I just steal from the people I'm now going to control for a year or 2 or longer. And that's how the entire system was set up. And so it was just a system of complete, vassalship over the locals that had been conquered. And that's what warfare was for in the Roman Republic. One point before I get to the warfare aspect was that Scheidel points out that one of the only reasons that these vast levels of inequality were able to develop was that there were relatively stable periods of peace, because the Roman Republic itself, even though it was constantly at war with other nations and regions, the state itself was stable for several hundred years, and that's what allowed these levels of inequality to develop. the more stable your system is, the more inequality is going to develop, and that seems to be what is it seems to be true today too. So one of the other aspects of warfare in the Roman Republic and Empire was that when you could go to war, and when you went to war and you conquered another people, then whoever you conquered, it was your right to then enslave whoever you conquered and steal all their stuff. Mm-hmm. And that was the booty that was then delivered to the troops as payment for conquering this other people. So it was basically, okay, well, we're going to, you see that group of people over there, we're going to go attack them, steal all their stuff, and enslave them, and then get rich off of it. And that's how some people made their money. It was a totally legitimate way, within that class, of getting rich, just through theft, warfare, and enslavement.
There's another element to this which I find quite interesting, especially with the Roman Empire, and that is that this elite class that would hold these consulships and who were senators and they were called the Optimates. This ruling class would meet. They had this veneer or this pretense of being in a republic, a democracy, and basically these guys would get up and speak before one another. And you had guys like Cato who would get up, and they had such a gift, some of them, for rhetoric and for making the case for certain policies in defense of exploiting the merchant class or not passing a certain bill that would alleviate the suffering of the kind of peasantry or the lower classes. That was their CNN. That was their New York Times and their Washington Post. They would get up in many cases and just flat out lie and do it with such a plume, do it with such a skill and a wit and a rhetoric level that they would take people in, and they would rouse the emotions of certain people, and that's how they would win influence in many cases. So, in present day, obviously, you have people with, Trump could not be Trump without his bombastic and some would argue, charismatic criticisms and bombs that he drops on people. That he has the balls and the gumption to put out there. When Bill Clinton was a president, another guy who was very highly articulate and for all his major failings and his corrupt nature, he was able to talk the talk. So this was it's not clear that this was even an element that had a great part to do in the Chinese Empire, although it may very well have been. Getting the ear of the emperor and becoming his second or third or 10th in command probably required some amount of verbal talent. So there was, that was the media, that was the newspapers and the TV and the sound bites. It was these guys who made speeches before their constituency and vied for influence, and they could lie through their teeth, and they can in the case of guys like Cicero, they can exalt themselves to the status of father of Rome, and have a certain number of people believe it for a period of time, for as long as he needed to, just to win a certain amount of influence and consolidate power for himself. So that's just another kind of dimension to all this that seemed crucial.
I want to read a quote about the final dynasty that he talks about in China, the Manchu king. Not sure how to pronounce that. He says the final dynasty, which had confiscated and reallocated vast Ming estates to the imperial clan and others, was beset by a wide array of tax corruption schemes. These were some of the ones I was mentioning. Officials concealed embezzlement by fabricating arrears, exaggerated the scale of natural disasters that required tax exemptions, falsely declared a barren status for their own land, borrowed tax advances from the rich, stole the money, and then applied the liabilities as arrears to commoners, reclassified land but collected taxes at the usual rate, pocketing the difference, and withheld or falsified receipts. Gentry or retired officials often paid no tax at all, with active officials and clerks passing the burden on to commoners in exchange for a cut of the profit. Finally, land was registered under as many as hundreds of false names, which made it too cumbersome to track down small arrears. Corruption by high officials was a standard mechanism of wealth accumulation, the more so the higher the rank. According to one estimate, average incomes of officials amounted to 12 times their official legal incomes in the form of salaries, rewards, and allowances, but well more than 100 times for a governor-general, and as much as 400,000 times in the case of He Shen, Grand Secretary of the King Court, in the second half of the 18th century. Executions and confiscations were employed as equally timeless countermeasures. Present-day China demonstrates the remarkable resilience of such practices. As a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, Zhu Yongkang was able to acquire 326 properties all over China worth about $1.76 billion, in addition to $6 billion deposited in hundreds of bank accounts that belonged to him and family members, and securities worth another $8.24 billion. When he was arrested in December 2014, domestic and foreign banknotes worth $300 million were found in his various residences alongside stashes of gold. Thanks to his exalted rank, his exploits dwarf those of his rivals. His total wealth would have put him in the 55th spot in the Forbes World's Billionaires ranking for 2015, even though they tried hard.
Loser.
An entire ton of neatly boxed up cash was discovered in one general's mansion, and even a mid-level water supply official in a resort town popular with party leaders managed to accumulate real estate and cash worth more than $180 million. Mm-hmm. So this is the kind of just graft that happens in, kind of everywhere. And it's a similar thing that the Lebanese are protesting against right now. Just this, it's a system that's been entrenched for hundreds of years of basically political patronage and corruption. It's just the way things. It's just the way things work, unfortunately. And maybe one other example that he talks about. This is the case of Mamluk Egypt from 1250 to 1571, in which this principle. Inasmuch as inequality could be contained within intact imperial polities, it was by means of violent recirculation of assets within the elite. So he says he's already mentioned this case of Mamluk Egypt, in which this principle played out in maybe its purest historical documented form. The Sultan, his emirs, and their slave soldiers shared the proceeds of conquest. They formed an ethnically separate and spatially detached ruling class bent on extracting rents from the subordinate indigenous population, which was brutalized if revenue flows failed to meet expectations, similar to Rome. Incessant jockeying for power within this class determined individual incomes, and violent conflict frequently altered these allocations. Local property owners sought refuge in extortion rackets that had them cede responsibility for their assets to strongmen from the Mamluk caste and pay fees in exchange for protection from taxation, a practice backed by elites who took their cut. Rulers responded by increasingly resorting to outright confiscation of elite wealth. So essentially, the picture he's painting is just that for all of these periods of history and all of these empires, the elite classes have essentially just been mafias.
Exactly.
And they're really no different. And then, except that they're mafias that paint themselves as the kind of fathers of their country, like you mentioned Cicero, and these benevolent leaders looking after and protecting their subjects, when essentially they may offer protection, but it's a protection racket. It's the protection that the corner mafioso is offering you, at the point of a gun. There's when you strip back the propaganda and the image making, that's essentially what you have is just a mafia state and various mafia states, unfortunately.
Well, you said that, and I was thinking of civil forfeiture and this new racket that the police in the U.S. are engaged in at the moment, where they get you on the on some kind of technical violation that maybe they found a small amount of marijuana in a state where it's still illegal, or they find it in your car, or you've done some kind of minor infraction. And
even not. I've heard cases where they just pull you over where they think you might have committed something, but they might not even think that. But then they just, go on.
Well, exactly. They confiscate. They take your shit. They take your stuff. They might take your car. They might go to your home. And this has become an institutionalized practice in the past 5 to 10 years. This is a kind of major development that is indicative of a police state that has. And what is a police state? I mean, it's where local law enforcement has become militarized and incentivized to confiscate property because it's become, it's in this technically legal, if not morally illegal framework. And why has this happened? Everything that the U.S. has become in the last 15 or 20 years after 9/11 has been a movement towards this hyper militarized global mafia. There's the CIA and the State Department have always instituted color revolutions and coups around the world, but they've gone into this kind of hyper aggressive mode. Which is reflected domestically. So we're seeing this across the board, and the police are for lack of a better description, in some cases or in many cases, mafiaized, and it's. When you read stories of individuals and how little recourse they've had, given the laws to get their stuff back, because of all the legal wrangling and attorney fees that are involved, and perhaps a bureaucracy that's sympathetic to and getting a cut of all of this confiscation, it's become state-sponsored. Extortion, and like you were saying before, Harrison, there were Romans, elitists who had these governorships who were tried for extorting the people who were under them, but so often it wasn't because it was the right legal thing to do to call them on it and have some justice served. It was all political retribution. It was all elitist infighting. So, given the trajectory that the U.S. now appears to be on, I think most people are becoming more and more subject to this police state, this kind of mafioso state of being that may only. That they'll have little recourse to, except to finally reach that horrific tipping point that isn't going to solve anything, but is probably going to result in a lot of bloodshed.
It's all very uplifting, but I was thinking about it, and to make it even less uplifting, this is, as we've discussed, this is a problem that spans races, cultures, millennia. and it shows no signs of abating. And it just seems to be part and parcel of the human condition, really, that, there's petty tyranny and that there are powers in elite circles that just lure human minds in, or they just mold human minds to fetishize power and glory and worship of the self and narcissism and psychopathy and sociopathy and all of like the darkest instincts in human nature. But at the end of the day, this is something that has been observed in time immemorial for ever since it's been going on. There have been people who stand back and watch and say, "You're not any better than me. You're not God. You're not some, super powerful prophet. And at the end of the day, you will be reduced to the level that I'm at." And it's happened time and time again. One of the early popes, he was talking about how he offered up just small little donations to elite Roman families who had previously owned, large portions of the world, and who overnight were reduced to being paupers and beggars, begging the Pope, begging the earliest church for money, because they've lost everything, and now they're reduced to nothing. And that's where the wisdom of the Stoics and of the early philosophers and early Christianity and Confucius and all of these things really shines through, I think, and that this is a problem that mankind has been grappling with since we first observed it. Since we're not, the Occupy Wall Street wasn't the first people to observe that there was a 1% and that they seem to be able to do whatever they want, and the Trump supporters weren't the first ones to notice that there's crooked Clintonites in every organization who are above the law and who can do whatever they want, and there's an elite circle out to take out their popularly elected official. This is something that's been going on for, as we've said, since we have records, and it's a struggle. And in many ways, it's probably one of the biggest catalysts for that religious, spiritual awakening in just many areas across the world. Because how do you rectify? How do you live? Especially in the times that we're talking about. Under slaves, being extorted. Barely a tenth of the population can even live above surplus, or can live without above subsistence levels. There's more to life than these crazy individuals seem to think. And in the long term, I would say that we have learned quite a bit, and that we are the other side, not just the crazy elite power hungry side. The other side, we're still we're better off. We're better off than they are, immeasurably better off, with all the riches and whatnot that they have. The morals and the lessons that are on the the poor or whatever, the ones who aren't in power. There's still hope there. It's like, it reminds me of the True Detective, the final scene in the first episode of True Detective, where what's his name, Rust, is outside and they're looking up at the sky, and he says something to the effect that it's at one time it was just pure darkness, but now you can see the light. He's like, I think that means we're winning. In some ways, that's as corny as of a lesson to take away from that. It just means that there's another side to things. It's not just about power. It's not just about inequality in that sense. It's about it's not just about the great game, but it's about the great arts of the soul, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I want to come back to is that modern vision of what the state is and should be, and how I think there is some validity to that, just in the sense that, first of all, because there are a lot of people that believe it, and even some like public servants and civil servants that believe it. There are politicians who actually do have ideals, whether or not they manage to implement them or not is another question. But there is both a tradition and a reality behind that sentiment, that there is a place for kind of selfless public service. Taking that into account, I think that it's important not to fall into both like a resentment and a total cynicism about this. On the other hand, there is a place for cynicism. There are certain harsh realities that I think should be accepted. But I think that those two can kind of go together in some way, that you can hold on to a certain ideal, but ground it in realism. And what I mean by that is to realize in your utopian thinking that there are certain aspects of your utopian thinking that are totally unrealistic, that will never come about. But there are certain principles in there that are probably worth hanging on to and worth trying to exemplify primarily in your own life, and trying to spread them through your own life and through your influence to those around you. Mm-hmm. Because when you... So in a lot of the utopian political ideologies and philosophies, there's this idea of removing inequality. Well, we have to just eliminate that notion from our minds. We're never going to eliminate equality. We have to plan for equality. I think this is what I don't think very many people have ever actually done, is to account for inequality. Say, okay, well, these are the things we're never going to eliminate. Now, how do we operate within this system? What policies can we push or move towards that will mitigate some aspects of that system, but which won't try to tear it all down, because it's impossible to tear it all down? Basically, we need to be realistic and practical at the same time that we're idealistic. We have to make a marriage between those two aspects of our aspirations. And I guess... just that we have to take into account that there are things that will never change, and then find a way to maneuver within those things that can't change in order to make things right. And I like that you brought up Stoicism, because that brings it down to the very individual level. I think there is a place for kind of political evolution and introduction of potentially effective policies that would mitigate some aspects of the problems in that we see, dealing with corruption and those kinds of things, knowing that we're never going to eliminate them completely. But what we can do in our own lives is learn to navigate that situation for ourselves, so that we're not controlled by the circumstances around us. And that's kind of one of the central things about Stoicism, and not just Stoicism, but various philosophies and kind of worldviews that are compatible with Stoicism. You find the same thing in early Christianity, in the letters of Paul. At one point, Paul says that he has been initiated into great wealth and great poorness, essentially. He's been rich and poor, and he knows the secrets of each. That it is possible to live a good life with very little money, and it's possible to live a totally wretched life with a lot of money, and vice versa. That if we, by focusing so much on wealth and our own money, we're missing something about we're missing something about the potentials that are actually in front of us, regardless of our place in that hierarchy. So, I guess it just comes down to learning to navigate your life, realizing what conditions you're in, and realizing that despite all of those, despite whatever forces are out there in the world keeping you down, there's still an area of movement, still a degree of freedom that you have within those strictures. And what comes to mind for me are the stories of kind of the great martyrs and heroes, even of the last 100 years. Those people who, even in imprisonment, whether it's under a totalitarian government or for some other reason, who retain their freedom, their freedom of their internal freedom, even within those conditions. And again, that goes back to Stoicism and early Christianity. It's the inner fortitude and character that can be expressed regardless of the external conditions over which you have no control. And when you are able to maintain that freedom despite the factors oppressing you from the outside, then you're living a life that's more worth living than anyone else, than the people oppressing you, than the prison guards and the arbitrary and like the arbitrary rulers that are just power hungry,
and have a sickness of the soul,
right?
Really.
Well,
I just wanted to add that by the same token, I don't think that what you're saying is having as one of your focuses living in comfort, monetary and financial and physical comfort is a bad thing. Not at all. In fact, as things continue to destabilize all around us in various ways, making sure that you are healthy and physically and strong and secure in your environment, and having some modicum of financial independence is probably as wise a thing as you can do, as not becoming too identified with the accrual of wealth and the trappings of external power, because that's a part of it too. Just basic day-to-day living, or even more than basic, because there are always expenses and needs that arise that are unanticipated. So just thought I'd put that out there as well.
Well, I just, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to say? Well, I wanted to finish by reading an interesting little quote from Walter's book. Guan Fu, he's talking about China, I believe it was in the Han dynasty, during the Han dynasty. Guan Fu, a highly placed government official, had accumulated a large fortune and owned so much land in his native region that widespread loathing of his preeminence inspired a local children's song. While the Ying River is clear, the Guan family will be secure. When the Ying River is muddy, the Guan family will be exterminated. This cute little ditty captured the precarious fortunes of the politically wealthy. More often than not, families that had risen high fell far. Risks extended to the very top of the status pyramid, to the families of the Han Emperor's consorts. So, in that, what those little kids really captured was the uncontrollable natural force that is this hierarchy that we are a part of. You have no idea. It's like the Stoics said, you have to, they practice some sort of a detachment from, these influences in life that are outside of your power and outside of your control. And that, in fact, there's higher values out there beyond being poor or being rich. These are just very superficial things that will happen, they can change, just like they point out the Ying River changes. The Ying River changes, so will your fortune in life, so will the status in life. But that, as the Stoics also point out, is that is something that's been developed over the years, that there's much higher values there. And in my opinion, reading books like this, gaining this kind of insight, from the works of people who have labored, sometimes their whole lives to figure out the theoretical and evidential problems behind understanding the history, understanding, problems like inequality and violence in society, that, this is a much higher value, and they've given us, and Walter himself has given us a great insight by publishing this book. So that said, we are going to tune out this week. We hope that you hit smash like, grab, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.